Chicago is considered the Mecca, if you will, when it comes to black power, yet it is the fifth most segregated city in the country. It has cost African Americans upwards of nearly $5 billion in economic impact. A new study was released this week by the Metropolitan Planning Council and the Urban Institute, which looked at racial and economic cost of segregation. They say black folks have lost $4.4 billion in additional income. The homicide rate will be 30% lower. There will be 83,000 more college graduates in the city. Joining us right now via Skype from Chicago is Alden Loury, Director of Research and Evaluation for the Metropolitan Planning Council. Alden, I spent 6 years in Chicago running the Chicago Defender, being at WVON Radio, often talked about this. And I tell people all the time, you go into Chicago, you don't have you don't have a black-owned restaurant there. All jokes aside, the prominent black comedy club in the 80s and 90s, when they tried to move to the north side, literally, they shut them down, would not grant the permits because they didn't want those people coming into their neighborhood. And so people really don't understand, unless you live there, how segregated that city is and how people are confined to their neighborhoods.
Yeah, and what we wanted to do with the study was to provide real numbers in terms of what that separation is costing, not just black people and not just black people on the south and west sides of the city, but what it's costing the entire region. And so we contracted with the Urban Institute to develop the study. They performed the study looking at 3 segregation measures: economic segregation and segregation between African Americans and whites and Latinos and whites. And what they found were the findings that you produced for the Chicago region, I should say, not just the city, but for the region as a whole, $4.4 billion. And that's based on their research, which shows that when you look across the 100 largest metros in the nation, generally speaking, as the level of black-white segregation increases, the income, the per capita income of African Americans decreases. And there could be a host of reasons why, but some of the things that you mentioned are very clear illustrations of what life is like in the city of Chicago, and to a larger extent, the region of Chicago. You can go for miles, literally, and be in a black space, and then it changes to a different kind of space, a white space or a Latino space, and that's a very common observation here in Chicago, in the city and the region.
Well, folks also don't realize when I moved there, I had a meeting with then Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr., and he showed me the tourism map, and that is the tourism map in Chicago stopped literally at 22nd Street. It did not go past 22nd Street, and so forget going to Bronzeville. They said, no, look, you come here, you're not going there. Also, when he was trying to get the airport in the south suburbs, they fought that big time. He kept trying to make the argument that that airport, which Chicago needs the additional airport in his mind, could do for that south region what O'Hare has done for that region there, for that part of the Chicago area, and folks fought it tooth and nail. He was trying to make the economic argument, and folks said, absolutely not.
And that's one of the things to really keep in mind with this when you talk about, well, does it really matter? It does, because when spaces become black spaces, in some respects, they are completely written off by the rest of the community. And so you can have a south side of Chicago, a west side of Chicago that has real economic buying power, but you don't get the retailers, you don't get the kind of investment that you need. As a result, the people in those communities have to go elsewhere to spend their money. Around the time that you were here and at the Defender, I remember doing a story with one of the reporters at the Chicago Reporter. We found that there was $5 billion in retail leakage from black communities in the city of Chicago. So there's real money there, there's real value and power there, but because there's such a reticence to develop and provide income and resources in those communities, that money has to go elsewhere, and that ultimately is to the detriment of those communities as well.
And what you've done with this study, why this is critically important, because having that homicide rate in there is vital. I have said this to this White House. I've said it to senior administration officials. I've said it to others. You cannot talk about the issue of violence in Chicago unless you deal with the educational and economic apartheid that has existed in Chicago for the last 80 years.
In supplemental research, you're right, Roland. In supplemental research that we've done earlier this year, we showed that when you look at the city of Chicago in particular, and you break down the city by census tracts, and you look at their homicide rates, and then you also look at their levels of poverty, of employment, of individuals without a bachelor's degree, you find that as the numbers of people in poverty who are unemployed, who don't have a bachelor's degree go up, your homicide rate goes up, and it goes up dramatically. So, we think that those are kind of contributing factors to the violence. And the report that we released this week shows that as a result of segregation, that rate could be lower. And that higher rate is costing not just the places where we really think about when we think about homicides, but it's costing the entire region. The Chicago region suffers from this reputation of being a violent city, of being a violent region, and that impact is felt across the region. And in the report, we talk about a $6 billion loss in residential real estate value as a result of the level of homicides that we see because of our increased level of black-white segregation.
Alden, where can people get a copy or take a look at this survey, this study?
You can go to our website, metroplanning.org. Again, that's metroplanning.org. The cost of segregation report is right there on the front. There's a link to get to a website where we lay out the report and where you can download a PDF.
All right, Alden Loury, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Roland.
I want to go to economist Julian Malveaux first. Again, this is the piece that I think whenever we're talking about what's happening in urban areas that a lot of white folks don't want to deal with, and African Americans have to become more well versed on this, and that is you have to tie historically, which this study also does, the historical housing patterns and how jobs were ignored. The City College of Chicago a few years ago also did their own study that showed the economic impact of African Americans frozen out of the labor unions, especially the building trades unions. This is how we get to this income disparity, and the average white family having $110,000 in wealth and the average black family having $5,000 in wealth. Julian.
Roland, one of the most important things to look at here is not only the impact on the African American community, but the impact on GDP in general. So it's not just that black folks are losers, it's that the entire Chicago region is a loser when you lock people out. What you're doing is you're suppressing people's human capital. And as you say, Chicago was well known. People would come up from Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. It was the draw. The Chicago Defender, in fact, you had a brother on about a year ago who wrote the book about the Defender. That was the organ to attract people.
Ethan McKaylee.
Yes, to attract people to Chicago. I used to joke that everybody would send a picture of themselves in Chicago standing next to a Cadillac. They just didn't tell anybody it wasn't their Cadillac. But they said that people look and say, if old dumb Bubba could get a Cadillac, I can move to Chicago and give me one too. But the real deal is that the entire GDP essentially is suppressed. Economic opportunities have been missing. Maggie Anderson and her husband did a book, A Year of Buying Black, and was basically focused in Chicago. And what they found is you had so little economic development because of the perception that those areas were dangerous, high crime, low economic, and they aren't.
Ralph, the thing is this here. Anytime Donald Trump talks about Chicago, what's happening there, and I can tell you, I made it clear to a senior administration official at that network luncheon that took place. I said, look, if you want to confront what's happening in Chicago, you had better deal with education and economics and not just talk about law and order.
Oh, absolutely. You know, nothing is ever going to be solved simply by locking people up. You will never be able to lock enough people up to change anything. Economics does have to be a serious discussion. Education has to be on the table as well. And, you know, and segregating neighborhoods, you know, that's never good. It's never good for the majority. It's never good for the minority. But in saying that, we also have to admit that we as black people, we are strong and we are resilient. And, you know, you look at Black Wall Street in Tulsa, you couldn't get any more segregated than that, but that community was able to thrive. And for one, even though we shouldn't have to, wait a minute, even though we shouldn't have to overcome segregation, we can do it, and we need to get the drugs out of our own neighborhood. We need to get back to the moral core in our communities, and we can prosper.
Ralph. First of all, I hear all that. Well, let me be real clear. Again, if anybody wants to understand Chicago, read the book Fire on the Prairie. Scott, read what Harold Washington had to endure when he ran for mayor. When in a Democratic city, when he ran against a guy, he beats the incumbent Jane Byrne. He beats Richard Daley in the primary. They run a guy, a Republican, in the general election. And Washington barely wins. And they were attacking him. And then the whites on the city council did everything they could to block Harold Washington, block all of his advancements, and they changed. And after Harold Washington died, of a heart attack at his desk, shortly after being reelected, they changed the rules to ensure you had to have a majority of the votes in the primary, or there would be a runoff. Chicago has blocked folks when it comes to the public sector dollars. Only a handful of black folks that they pre-approve, if you will. They have locked black people out of economics in Chicago. That's real, Scott.
Yeah, Roland, you're absolutely right. I grew up in Chicago and Joliet, Illinois, and I lived through those times. Fast Eddie Verdoliak is who you're really talking about, who was the nemesis for all of this. But let me say this. The most powerful part of this report, I think, is that it confirms that racism trumps capitalism. That $4 billion, that $5 billion of loss for that region, probably the second or third largest business region in this country, those are losses not just for people of color, but those are losses for white businesses, white Americans, those who are living the American dream far better than people of color. My goodness gracious, wouldn't any business like to have that $4 billion invested, not just in the African American community, but all communities? It's a sad testament of what it means when you read that report and read the results of the report. Black people and white people ought to be wanting to change that.
Yeah.
Avis.
They ought to be wanting to change it. You're exactly right. But they don't. And they don't just because of the reason that you just described. The reality is that over and over and over again, how many examples can we show that, largely speaking, white supremacy in this country trumps logic, it trumps reason, it also trumps economic advantage. You need no better example of that to look over at the White House and see who's sitting in there right now.
A peaceful protest turned deadly. 37-year-old black man was shot and killed by Baton Rouge police. His hands are in the air, and you still get shot by the cops.
Oh my God, please don't tell me he's dead.
We're not gonna let hate define us.
Race is a big part of this.
If truly all lives matter, then all lives need to matter equally.
What we require is action. What we require is accountability. We understand that black lives do matter, and we will keep focused on this issue.
News 1 Now, every weekday morning at 7 on TV 1.